You're done. Card's dead. Book your own flight home if you can afford one. I stood in the polished lobby of the Burj Al Arab, reading the message for the fourth time. The marble under my dress shoes felt colder than the air conditioning humming through the massive atrium. My boss's words glowed on my phone screen at 1:47 in the morning Dubai time. I was 7,000 miles from home, holding exactly $80 in American cash and 200 dirham in my wallet. I didn't shout. I didn't slam my phone into the fountain. I simply typed back, my thumb steady and slow. Understood. Thank you for the update. But Rowan had no idea what he'd just done. He didn't realize I was the only person in the entire company who actually understood the fine print of the $2.4 billion merger. We were exactly 3 days away from closing. I lowered myself onto a velvet bench near the concierge desk, staring at the glowing screen. The message was from Rowan. It arrived at 1:47 a.m. local time, but sleep had been a foreign concept for the last 96 hours anyway. I read it once more just to be sure my exhausted brain wasn't hallucinating. Then I typed my calm response, my thumb hovering for a full second before I hit send. I locked the phone and set it face down on the bench beside me. I was 7,000 miles from home, stranded in the United Arab Emirates without a corporate credit card, and apparently, suddenly unemployed. It was a hell of a way to end a Wednesday. To understand how I ended up abandoned in the desert by a boss who genuinely believed himself untouchable, we need to rewind. My name is Marcus. I am 51 years old. For the past 6 years, I worked as the Senior Director of Corporate Development at Halcyon Financial Group, a mid-sized private equity firm out of Chicago. The title sounded impressive on LinkedIn, but the reality was less glamorous. I ran due diligence on acquisitions, structured deals, and negotiated the fine print that turned handshake agreements into legally binding transactions. I spent my days buried in term sheets, red-line contracts, and endless calls with foreign counsel across 6 time zones. My work kept the pipeline moving so Halcyon could brag about its 22% internal rate of return to limited partners. More importantly than any of that, I am a widower. My wife Sarah passed away 4 years ago from an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer, and it hollowed out our whole world. Our son Elliot is now 14, and since Sarah died, Elliot and I have been navigating life together, one clumsy step at a time. Every late night at the office, every red-eye flight, every missed baseball game, I told myself was for him. The paycheck kept the house we bought together, funded therapy for both of us, and secured Elliot's future. Then there was Rowan. Rowan is 34 years old, wears bespoke suits imported from Milan, and possesses the emotional intelligence of a parking meter. He was promoted to managing director 2 years ago, largely because his father-in-law happened to sit on our board of directors. Since he took over the deal team, morale at Halcyon collapsed. He demanded weekend work without additional compensation, ignored the basic FLSA regulations regarding exempt classifications that didn't actually apply to several of our junior associates, and made verbal promises about carried interest that always evaporated when bonus season rolled around. I once mentioned to him that his practices bordered on promissory estoppel. He laughed and told me to stick to spreadsheets. The breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing was, essentially, the wallpaper of his management style. He only cared about closing deals and taking credit. Things came to a head about 12 days ago. Our most significant deal of the fiscal year, the acquisition of a Dubai-based fintech company called Meridian Digital Holdings, was showing serious cracks. Meridian was run by an Emirati businessman named Khalid, 58 years old, alongside his younger business partner Rashid, 44. Khalid was old school in the best possible way. He conducted business over long dinners, cared deeply about mutual respect, and valued personal relationships above spreadsheets. The company he built was worth $2.4 billion on paper, and Halcyon had spent 18 months courting him. Rowan, in his infinite wisdom, had sent Khalid an email the previous Friday demanding a last-minute revaluation of the deal. He wanted a 12% reduction in the purchase price, citing market volatility concerns that were largely manufactured. He also inserted aggressive language about post-close management, essentially threatening to replace Khaled's entire executive team within 90 days of closing. Khaled did not respond with a counteroffer. He responded with a formal notice indicating that Meridian was reconsidering the terms of the letter of intent. He mentioned, almost as a courtesy, that Sterling Capital, our largest competitor, had reached out. Their head of acquisitions, a razor-sharp veteran named Priya, 47, had been trying to poach the deal for 6 months. Rowan had handed her the opening on a silver platter. Rowan called me into his glass-walled office at 6:15 p.m. on a Friday evening. He looked genuinely panicked for the first time since I'd met him. The Meridian acquisition was the cornerstone of our fund's Q4 performance narrative. If we lost it, our limited partners would start asking uncomfortable questions, and Rowan's father-in-law connection would only protect him for so long. "You need to fly to Dubai tonight," Rowan said, packing behind his glass desk. "Meet with Khaled. Take him to dinner, apologize, do whatever it takes to keep this deal alive. Do not let Priya near him." I stared at him from the leather chair across the room. "Tonight, Rowan, it's Friday evening. I have Elliot this weekend. I can't just abandon my 14-year-old son on 4 hours' notice. I need at least 24 hours to arrange proper care for him." "Figure it out," he snapped, jabbing a manicured finger at me. "Call your mother, hire a babysitter, send him to boarding school for all I care. If you're not on that plane tonight, don't bother showing up on Monday. Consider it a voluntary resignation." The threat hung in the air between us like smoke. I needed this job. Elliot was starting high school in the fall. The mortgage on our house was substantial, and Sarah's medical bills, though largely covered, had left dents in our savings that I was still filling in. I swallowed my dignity, walked back to my office, and made the second hardest phone call of my life to my late wife's sister, begging her to take Elliot for the week. At home, Elliot was sprawled on the couch, watching some documentary about deep-sea creatures. He looked up when I walked in with my carry-on bag already packed. I had promised to take him to a college campus visit that Saturday, a preliminary look at a school he'd been researching obsessively for months. "You're going away again," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. "Kiddo, I have to. It's a work emergency. If I don't handle this, I could lose my job." "You've said that every single time for the last 2 years," Elliot replied, his voice hollow rather than angry, which was somehow worse. "Just go." He turned back to his documentary and didn't look at me again. I stood in the doorway of our living room for maybe 10 seconds, feeling like the worst father in the world. I closed the door behind me and got into the town car waiting at the curb. The driver, a quiet older man named Hassan who I'd used dozens of times before, glanced at me in the rearview mirror and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. I wasn't fine, but there was no productive way to explain to a stranger that my son had just given up on believing I would ever prioritize him. The 14-hour flight from O'Hare to Dubai International passed in a haze of stale airline coffee, half-eaten meals, and endless notes scrawled across a yellow legal pad. I mapped out every possible objection Khaled might raise, drafted 3 separate apology scripts, and gamed out how to neutralize Priya's inevitable interference. I had absolutely no idea that Rowan was already positioning me as the fall guy the moment things went sideways. I landed in Dubai on a Sunday morning and headed straight to the address my assistant had confirmed. Meridian's headquarters occupied the entire 47th floor of a gleaming tower in the DIFC financial district. But my first meeting wasn't scheduled there. Khaled had insisted, through his executive assistant, that we meet at his personal home in the Emirates Hills neighborhood, an exclusive gated community where the villas started at $30 million and only grew more extravagant from there. I understood the message immediately. This wasn't going to be a boardroom negotiation. This was going to be a test of character. The moment the driver pulled up to Khaled's compound, I felt out of my depth. The house was massive but tasteful, all clean lines and pale limestone. Khaled met me at the door personally, wearing a traditional white kandjara, his silver beard neatly trimmed. He was 58 years old, but he moved with the easy confidence of a man who had built something real from nothing. Rashid, his 44-year-old business partner, greeted me with a firm handshake in the marble foyer. When I introduced myself as the Senior Director of Corporate Development from Halcyon Financial Group, the polite warmth in the room dropped by several degrees. Halcyon had made promises to Khalid 2 years earlier during a preliminary conversation that had never materialized, and Rowan's recent email had reopened old wounds. Rebuilding trust wasn't going to happen over a single cup of Arabic coffee. They led me to a shaded veranda overlooking a private garden. I sat down across from Khalid at a low table, and a household staff member set down small cups of kahwa and a plate of dates. I didn't launch into corporate talking points. I didn't defend Rowan's email or make excuses for the pressure coming down from Chicago. I looked Khalid directly in the eye and told him exactly what had gone wrong. I acknowledged that the sudden revaluation demand violated the spirit of our letter of intent, and that Rowan's tone reflected a fundamental breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. I told him I was there to fix it, to build something durable, and to make sure his life's work was respected by whoever ultimately acquired it. Rashid crossed his arms, clearly unconvinced. But Khalid slowly nodded, took a long sip of his coffee, and agreed to give me a chance to present a revised structure. That chance turned into a grueling stretch of 9 straight days. Every morning by 7 a.m., I was at Meridian's offices in DIFC, reviewing financial statements, meeting department heads, and stress testing every assumption in our valuation model. Every evening I sat with Khalid, sometimes at his home, sometimes at a small restaurant in the old souk where he had eaten as a young man. We didn't just discuss deal terms. We talked about our families, our histories, the losses that shaped us. I told him about Sarah. He told me about his own late brother. Khalid showed me photographs of his 3 grown children and his 6 grandchildren. Rashid, who had initially treated me with cool politeness, began to warm up as he watched his mentor treat me like a peer rather than an adversary. On the 6th evening, over grilled sea bass at a quiet restaurant tucked into a corner of the Al Fahidi Historic District, Khalid told me that in his 40 years of business, he had learned that contracts were just paper. What mattered was the character of the man holding the pen. He said Rowan had failed that test in a single email. He wanted to know if I would pass it. By day 8, we had a revised deal structure on the table. Meridian would be acquired at the original purchase price of $2.4 billion, but with several critical modifications. Khalid and his executive team would retain operational control for a minimum of 3 years post-close, with performance milestones tied to earn-out payments that could push the total transaction value to $2.7 billion. Halcyon would gain a strategic foothold in the Middle East fintech market that would justify years of favorable positioning to our limited partners. It was, without exaggeration, the best deal I had ever structured in my career. It also positioned Halcyon to dominate a sector that Sterling Capital had been trying to crack for a decade. But Khalid, like Giovanni before him in a story I would only later hear parallels of, was nobody's fool. He had watched Rowan operate through email exchanges over the past several months, and he did not trust the man behind the letterhead. On day 9, as I prepared to present the term sheet for final approval, Rowan insisted on being included via video conference. He said he wanted to be personally involved in the closing dynamics. I knew what that actually meant. He wanted to swoop in at the last moment and take credit for the entire negotiation with our fund's investment committee. The video conference was scheduled for 4 p.m. Dubai time, which was 7 a.m. Chicago. I set up in a conference room on the 47th floor of Meridian's headquarters, with Khalid and Rashid seated beside me. Rowan's face filled the massive display screen at the end of the polished wooden table, and he looked like he had rolled out of bed 15 minutes earlier. He didn't offer a proper greeting. He didn't acknowledge Khalid or Rashid by name. He launched immediately into a monologue about aggressive integration timelines and streamlining redundant leadership structures. using language that directly contradicted every commitment I had spent 9 days negotiating. I watched Khalid's expression harden. Rashid's hand curled into a fist on the table. I tried to interject, gently steering the conversation back to the agreed terms, but Rowan cut me off. He told me, on speaker, in front of the men whose life work we were trying to acquire, that I needed to remember my lane, and that the adults would handle the strategic discussion from here. Then he ended the call abruptly, saying he had a breakfast meeting to prepare for. The silence in the conference room afterward was heavier than anything I had ever experienced professionally. Khalid stood up slowly and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Dubai skyline. When he turned back, his face was calm, but his eyes carried an intensity I hadn't seen before. He told me, in perfect measured English, that he would proceed with the acquisition. However, he had one absolute non-negotiable condition. The final purchase agreement would contain a legally binding clause stipulating that I, Marcus, would serve as the sole point of contact and integration lead for a minimum of 36 months following the closing. If Halcyon attempted to remove me from that role, or if Rowan attempted to interfere directly with post-close operations, the contract would trigger immediate voidance provisions with substantial financial penalties. Khalid explicitly cited the doctrine of promissory estoppel in his reasoning, stating clearly and on the record that Meridian's board was relying entirely on my personal representations and character to consummate this transaction, not on Halcyon's corporate reputation, which he no longer considered reliable. He made it unambiguously clear that if I was not the person running the integration, they would terminate discussions immediately and accept Sterling Capital's standing offer instead. I spent the next 6 hours in a conference room with Meridian's outside counsel, drafting the addendum language. It was ironclad, heavily weighted in favor of the target company, with liquidated damages provisions that would cost Halcyon $180 million if they violated the terms. Khalid and Rashid signed the amended letter of intent the following morning at 9 a.m. sharp. We shared a quiet breakfast of shakshuka and fresh flatbread before I began preparing for my return to Chicago. I had just secured the largest cross-border acquisition in Halcyon's 22-year history, delivering $2.4 billion in enterprise value with meaningful upside potential. But I knew exactly what was waiting for me back in Chicago. I had a signed term sheet that made me structurally untouchable within my own company for the next 3 years. Rowan was going to lose his mind the moment he read the fine print and realized his control over the deal, and over me, had been surgically removed. I checked into a modest business hotel near the airport that Sunday evening, planning to fly back Monday morning. I sent Rowan a brief email at 11 p.m. Dubai time confirming that the letter of intent had been signed with revised terms and that I would present the full documentation upon my return. I did not mention the personnel clause. I wanted him to discover it himself, in front of the investment committee, when it would be far too late to do anything about it. That was my mistake. I underestimated how quickly a cornered animal can lash out. At 1:47 a.m. Dubai time, less than 3 hours after I sent that email, my phone lit up with Rowan's message. "You're done. Card's dead. Book your own flight home if you can afford one." I sat up in the hotel bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. I opened the wallet on my nightstand. I had $80 in American cash and 200 dirham, roughly $55 in local currency. My corporate card was reporting as declined on the hotel folio, which I discovered when I tried to order room service 20 minutes later just to test it. My personal checking account had maybe $1,400 in it until my next paycheck, which was now theoretically never coming. A one-way business class ticket from Dubai back to Chicago on short notice would run somewhere north of $6,000. Economy would still be around $2,200. The illegality of what Rowan had just done hit me almost as hard as the panic itself. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act and its implementing regulations, an employer cannot compel an employee to travel internationally for work purposes, terminate them mid-trip, and then refuse to cover the return travel expenses. That is settled law. Beyond that specific FLSA violation, this was a textbook breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing embedded in every employment relationship under Illinois state law. Halcyon had a legal obligation to act reasonably and in good faith toward me as their employee, not to strand me in a foreign country as retribution for successfully doing my job. And then there was the promissory estoppel angle, which was almost poetic given that Khalid had cited the same doctrine just hours earlier. I had incurred substantial personal expense and professional risk based entirely on Halcyon's explicit representations that they would cover travel costs and facilitate my return home. I had detrimentally relied on those representations. Now they were reneging without warning, without notice, and without any legitimate business justification. My personal lawyer, a sharp employment attorney named Danielle who I had put on retainer 3 years ago on Sarah's advice, would have a field day with the documentary evidence sitting in my email inbox. I forwarded the entire text thread with Rowan to my personal Gmail account, along with every corporate email confirming the business purpose of my Dubai travel, before Halcyon's IT department could think to revoke my access. I needed to call Elliot, but I knew if I heard his voice I would fall apart, and he had already been through enough with me being absent. Instead, I forced myself to get dressed at 2:30 a.m. Dubai time. I could not sit in that hotel room spiraling into panic. I had to face Khalid and Rashid with the truth before our scheduled Monday morning celebration meeting. They deserved to know exactly what kind of company they had just signed a letter of intent with. The concierge at my hotel was kind enough to hail me a taxi despite the hour, and I paid the fare with the last of my dirham. The drive to Khalid's Emirates Hills compound took 25 minutes through empty pre-dawn streets, giving me time to let the initial shock crystallize into something colder and more useful. Rowan thought he could discard me like a used napkin. He genuinely believed that his position, his father-in-law's board seat, and his expensive suits made him immune to consequences. When Khalid's night staff opened the compound gate and led me to a small sitting room, I found Khalid already awake, dressed in a simple gray thobe, drinking tea by lamplight. He looked completely unsurprised to see me. He told me later that men who have built empires from nothing learn to sleep lightly, especially when major transactions are in motion. Rashid arrived within 15 minutes, having been called by Khalid the moment my taxi cleared the compound gate. I explained what had happened, pulling out my phone and showing them the text message from Rowan. I explained that my corporate card had been deactivated, that I had roughly $80 in cash, and that I was effectively stranded in Dubai until I could arrange emergency funds from home. Khalid read the message twice. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted from cordiality to something far more dangerous. He handed the phone to Rashid, who read it and immediately began muttering in rapid Arabic that I could not follow but whose tone required no translation. This is how they conduct business. Khalid finally said, his voice quiet and level. This is how Halcyon treats the man who has spent 9 days honoring his word to us, sitting at my table, meeting my grandchildren, drinking coffee in my home. They cast him aside like garbage the moment his work is complete. I looked down at the ornate rug beneath my feet and told him I was sorry, that I had wasted his time, that the deal we had just structured was going to collapse the moment I returned to Chicago, and Halcyon realized the personnel clause was ironclad. You have wasted nothing, my friend, Khalid interrupted, his voice sharpening. You operated with honor. You are a man of your word. Halcyon Financial Group has just informed me, through their actions rather than their letterhead, that they are not the partners I wish to sell my life's work to. He stood up and walked to the window overlooking his darkened garden. Rashid remained seated but leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Khalid's back. When Khalid turned around, he was smiling, and the smile was not warm. It was the smile of a man who had just decided how a situation was going to end. Marcus, I want to tell you something that I have not previously shared, Khalid said, returning to his chair and refilling his tea. For approximately 14 months, Priya from Sterling Capital has been calling me every 3 weeks without fail. She has flown to Dubai twice on her own initiative, at Sterling's expense, simply to have dinner with Rashid and me. She has offered a competing bid that on paper is very similar to what Halcyon offered. We have declined her advances, not because Sterling is inferior, but because we preferred the strategic vision that Halcyon presented to us 18 months ago, because we preferred you. He paused, taking a slow sip of his tea. That preference has now expired. Rashid, please call Priya at her London office. It should be approximately 11 p.m. there. She has told me repeatedly that she is available at any hour to discuss this transaction. Let us test whether that claim is accurate. Rashid pulled out his phone without hesitation. Within 4 minutes, Priya was on speakerphone. She sounded fully alert, and I could hear the faint clink of ice in a glass in the background. Khalid explained the situation with characteristic brevity. Halcyon had breached the spirit of their agreement. Meridian was now open to concluding a transaction with Sterling Capital. However, there was a condition. Sterling would need to hire Marcus, meaning me, as the managing director responsible for leading the entire Meridian integration, and subsequently, Sterling's broader expansion into Middle Eastern financial services. Furthermore, Sterling would need to arrange and pay for my immediate return travel to Chicago in first-class accommodations, along with a signing bonus that reflected the value I was bringing to the transaction. Priya was silent for maybe 8 seconds. Then she asked, in a voice that suggested she was already mentally drafting the offer letter, whether I would be available for a video conference at 7 a.m. Dubai time, which would be midnight London time. Khalid told her that I would be. She said she would call back in 90 minutes with a formal proposal. The line went dead. Khalid looked at me across the small sitting room and said, quite simply, that I should try to sleep for an hour on his guest room sofa. He said that when a man is about to negotiate the most important terms of his professional life, he should not do it on empty adrenaline. I did not sleep, but I did lie on that sofa, staring at an intricate plaster ceiling, and I felt something shift inside my chest that I had not felt since Sarah's diagnosis. I felt like I might actually be okay. At exactly 7 a.m. Dubai time, Priya called back on video. She was seated in what appeared to be a home office in London, wearing a crisp blouse, her hair pulled back, looking as if she had been up for hours reviewing files. She had. Sterling's proposal was extraordinary. They were offering me the title of Managing Director of International Development, a base salary that represented a 55% increase over my Halcyon compensation, a signing bonus of $400,000 to compensate for the carried interest I would forfeit by leaving Halcyon, and a guaranteed minimum annual bonus for my first 3 years to bridge any transition-related uncertainty. They were also offering full remote work flexibility, with the understanding that international travel would be required, but structured around a schedule I controlled. Priya explained her reasoning with disarming directness. She said Sterling had been trying to break into the Middle East fintech market for a decade without success. Meridian was the crown jewel of that entire sector. If closing this deal required hearing the person Khalid trusted, that was a bargain at almost any price. She also said, more softly, that she had heard through industry channels about my wife's passing 4 years ago, and she wanted me to know that Sterling's culture valued sustainable performance over performative overwork. I did not weep in front of her, but it was a close thing. I accepted the offer verbally on that video call and asked her to send the formal paperwork to my personal email for review by Danielle, my employment attorney. Priya agreed and told me a Sterling-arranged car would collect me from Khalid's compound at 11 a.m. to take me to the Dubai International Financial Center, where Sterling maintained a small regional office. She said their compliance team would work with Meridian's counsel to restructure the transaction under Sterling's letterhead, using the same core terms I had negotiated with Halcyon, and that she expected the revised letter of intent to be executable within 48 hours. I ended the call, and Khalid, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room throughout the entire conversation, poured me another cup of tea. He told me that in his experience, difficult nights often precede important mornings, and that this appeared to be one of those mornings. Rashid excused himself to make his own phone calls, presumably to begin unwinding the operational preparations his team had been making for a Halcyon-led integration. I sat on Khalid's veranda as the sun rose over the Emirates hills, watching the pale desert light spread across the manicured landscape, and I thought about Elliot sitting in our house in Chicago, and about Sarah, and about how strange it was that the worst professional moment of my life had transformed into something else entirely inside the space of 4 hours. At 8:30 a.m. Dubai time, my phone began vibrating with a flood of messages from Rowan. He must have finally checked his email and realized the letter of intent I had sent contained the personnel clause. His messages arrived in rapid succession. "Marcus, we need to talk immediately. There's been a serious miscommunication. Your card has been reactivated. I've booked you a first-class ticket home for this evening. Please confirm. Marcus, please respond. The investment committee is meeting at 10 a.m. Chicago time and they need clarity on the Meridian terms. Marcus. Call ME now. Please. I'll authorize whatever you need. Just call Khalid and tell him the personnel clause was a misunderstanding." I stared at my phone screen, sitting on Khalid's veranda with a cup of tea cooling in my hand. Rowan was in full panic. He had realized, probably around 8 a.m. Chicago time when he actually opened the letter of intent, that firing me had triggered the void provisions on a $2.4 billion transaction. His father-in-law was going to receive a phone call from Halcyon's CEO within hours, and no amount of family connection was going to insulate Rowan from the consequences of losing the largest deal in the firm's history through pure, unforced arrogance. I did not respond to any of his messages. I did, however, take screenshots of every single one, and I forwarded them along with the earlier termination text to Danielle with a brief note explaining that I would need her services immediately for an employment matter and potentially for a broader wrongful termination and retaliation claim. Danielle responded within 12 minutes, despite the fact that it was 1 a.m. Chicago time. She told me not to communicate with Rowan or anyone at Halcyon directly, to preserve every scrap of documentary evidence, and to let her handle all subsequent communications through formal legal channels. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that the FLSA claim alone would likely settle in the mid-six figures once we filed, and that if we added retaliation and breach of contract claims related to the deferred compensation Rowan had promised over the past 2 years, we were looking at a potential settlement in excess of $1.2 million. I read her message twice and then set the phone face down on the table. At 11 a.m., Sterling's driver arrived at Khalid's compound in a black Mercedes. Khalid walked me to the car personally. Before I got in, he placed both hands on my shoulders and told me that in the Emirati tradition, a business relationship built on genuine respect creates obligations that transcend any single transaction. He said that regardless of what happened with Sterling, I would always be welcome in his home. Rashid embraced me briefly and told me he expected to see me back in Dubai within a month to begin integration planning. I got into the car with a lump in my throat and rode to the Sterling office in silence, watching Dubai's absurd skyline roll past the tinted windows. The Sterling meeting that afternoon lasted 6 hours. Priya had assembled her regional legal team, her CFO from London on video, and 2 members of Sterling's investment committee also joining remotely. We worked through every material term of the Halcyon Meridian letter of intent and restructured it under Sterling's corporate umbrella. Because Sterling was significantly larger than Halcyon and had a stronger balance sheet, we were actually able to improve certain terms for Meridian, increasing the earnout ceiling and reducing several restrictive covenants. Khalid joined us for the final 2 hours via video from his home office, and by 8 p.m. Dubai time, we had a signed letter of intent between Sterling Capital and Meridian Digital Holdings. The transaction was structured to close within 60 days. Priya's assistant had booked me a first-class seat on the Emirates flight departing Dubai at 2:15 a.m. I had just enough time to return to my modest business hotel, check out, retrieve my luggage, and grab a proper dinner at the airport lounge. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I finally opened my personal laptop and drafted an email to Elliot's aunt confirming that I would be home by Monday afternoon and asking if she could bring Elliot to meet me at the house rather than sending him back on his own. I wanted to be there when he walked in. I wanted him to see me before I saw him. Meanwhile, Rowan's world was imploding in real time back in Chicago. My phone continued to buzz throughout the flight, both with Rowan's increasingly frantic messages and, eventually, with communications from Halcyon's general counsel, an older attorney named Bernard who I had always respected. Bernard's email was formal and measured. He informed me that Halcyon was rescinding my termination effective immediately, that my company card was fully reactivated, that all deferred compensation would be paid out in full, and that Halcyon was prepared to offer significant additional consideration in exchange for my agreement to continue leading the Meridian transaction. Bernard was clearly trying to salvage what he already knew was unsalvageable. I forwarded his email to Danielle without responding. By the time I landed at O'Hare on Monday afternoon, Danielle had already sent Halcyon a formal preservation letter, demanding that they retain all documentation related to my employment, along with a preliminary demand for damages under the FLSA, the Illinois Wage Payment and Collection Act, and common law claims for breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing and promissory estoppel. She had also filed a preliminary complaint with the Illinois Department of Labor documenting the international abandonment. Halcyon's outside counsel responded within 4 hours with an initial settlement inquiry. Elliot was standing on the front porch when Hassan pulled up with me from the airport. He had grown, somehow, in 9 days. He didn't say anything when I stepped out of the car. He just walked down the driveway, dropped his backpack on the concrete, and wrapped his arms around me. I held him for a long moment on the front lawn, feeling him breathe against my shoulder, and I made him a quiet promise that this time I meant with every fiber of my being. I told him that the days of me disappearing for weeks at a time, missing his college visits and his baseball games and our Sunday breakfasts, were over. I told him that I had a new job, and that the new job understood that I was a father first and an executive second. He didn't say anything back. He just nodded against my shoulder. Sometimes, with 14-year-old boys, that's more than enough. The transition to Sterling Capital was faster than I expected. Priya cleared my calendar for the first 2 weeks so I could spend real time with Elliot before diving into the Meridian integration. She reminded me multiple times that Sterling's culture rewarded sustainable performance, not martyrdom. Within 6 weeks, the Meridian acquisition closed at the revised valuation of $2.6 billion, and I was traveling to Dubai on a controlled schedule of 1 week per quarter rather than living out of a suitcase. Khalid and Rashid treated the integration like a partnership rather than a takeover. Meridian's employees kept their jobs, their compensation structures, and their operational autonomy. The transaction became a case study in Sterling's internal training materials for how cross-border acquisitions should actually be conducted. Meanwhile, Halcyon Financial Group was disintegrating in real time. Losing the Meridian deal was the visible catalyst, but it exposed years of structural rot underneath. Limited partners began asking pointed questions about fund performance, and the answers were not good. 2 other pending acquisitions collapsed within 90 days as counterparties recognized that Halcyon's word had become worthless. The lawsuits started arriving in waves. Former employees who had been strung along with fake promises of carried interest filed a class action for breach of contract and promissory estoppel that would eventually cost Halcyon $18 million in settlements. The Illinois Department of Labor levied substantial fines for widespread FLSA violations, including exempt misclassification of junior associates who had been working 80-hour weeks without overtime compensation for years. Rowan was terminated for cause approximately 3 weeks after I left. His father-in-law's board seat could not survive the fund's public collapse, and the board voted unanimously to remove Rowan and pursue clawback provisions against his previous bonuses. Last I heard through industry contacts, he had spent 14 months unsuccessfully trying to find a comparable position and had eventually taken a business development role at a regional insurance brokerage in suburban Milwaukee. The luxury of arrogance turned out to be surprisingly expensive. My settlement with Halcyon closed at $1.65 million. Danielle earned every penny of her contingency fee. I used most of the settlement to pay off our mortgage entirely, top up Elliot's college fund, and establish a scholarship in Sarah's name at the hospital where she had received her cancer treatment. The rest went into a boring, sensible index fund that I do not check obsessively. I think about that night in the Burj Al Arab lobby sometimes, about how completely certain Rowan was that he had crushed me, about how he genuinely believed that his position, his family connections, and his corporate credit card constituted actual power. He never understood that real power comes from being the person who other people trust to keep their word. He never understood that the moment you treat people like disposable resources, you are one bad night away from discovering that they were the only thing holding your empire together.